Eliza Moreau had spent most of her life walking the fine line between privilege and loneliness. The Moreau family was known for their vast business empire, a legacy of generations of sharp-eyed businessmen who expanded their wealth across real estate, technology, and finance. But Eliza, their only daughter, was more known for her quiet grace and reserved personality. She was beautiful in an understated way, dark chestnut hair always in a neat braid, her brown eyes calm and observant rather than playful. But for all her wealth and beauty, Eliza had very few real friends. People either wanted to impress her or use her connections. Rarely anything in between. And so she grew accustomed to standing on the sidelines, watching the world through glass, separated by invisible barriers of money and status. Except when it came to James Westwood. James was different from everyone else. He was sharp, serious, and effortlessly intelligent, the kind of person teachers adored and students envied. His quiet confidence set him apart, and even though he wasn't from a wealthy family, he held himself with the same dignity as the sons of CEOs and politicians. Eliza had admired him from the moment she first saw him. It was the beginning of their second year in high school. Eliza had arrived late to class, her father having been caught up in a business call. When she entered the room, the only seat available was beside James. She remembered sitting down carefully, feeling her cheeks flush as James barely looked at her. His amber eyes were focused on the book in front of him. After a long moment, he glanced at her and said in a quiet voice, "You need a pen?" She had shaken her head quickly. "I'm fine." For the rest of the class, James remained focused, his brow furrowed slightly as he listened to the teacher. Eliza, however, could hardly concentrate. Her heart was beating too fast. Later that day after school, Eliza saw James standing by the vending machine in the hallway. He was fishing coins out of his pocket when one slipped from his hand and rolled across the floor. Without thinking, Eliza bent down, picked it up and handed it to him. "Here," she said, smiling. James looked at the coin in her hand, then at her face. His eyes were unreadable. "Thanks," he said shortly and walked away. But that was the beginning. He was different. Eliza started finding small ways to interact with James. She would sit next to him in class whenever possible, ask him for help with math problems, and occasionally bring him an extra bottle of water from the vending machine. James was always polite but distant, accepting her help without encouraging it. But there were moments that gave Eliza hope. Once during gym class, Eliza had nearly collapsed during the 800-meter run. James, who had already finished, doubled back and pulled her arm over his shoulder. "Come on," he had said, his tone brisk but not unkind. Eliza, breathless and light-headed, had leaned into him, the warmth of his arms steadying her. Another time she had been struggling with a complicated math problem during lunch. James had walked by, glanced down at her notebook and said, "You need to carry the one." She had blinked up at him, startled. He sighed, slid into the seat next to her, and explained the solution in a calm, steady voice. Eliza had stared at him in wonder as he stood up. "Thanks," she had said softly. James didn't smile, but his amber eyes lingered on her for a second longer than necessary before he turned and walked away. That was when Eliza knew she had fallen for him. But James never made things easy. The problem was Eliza's background. James's family wasn't wealthy. His father had died when he was young, and his mother worked long shifts at a local hospital to keep them afloat. James had earned a scholarship to the school, but it was clear that he always felt like an outsider among the children of wealth and privilege. Eliza represented everything he couldn't have. One afternoon, Eliza overheard some of the boys in the class talking near the lockers. "Man, Westwood's so dumb," one of them said, laughing. "If Adela likes him, he should just ride that wave all the way to the bank. Her family's practically royalty." James's cold voice cut through the laughter. "I'd rather work for the next 80 years than take her money." Eliza had frozen in place. She knew James had overheard the rumors about her crush on him, but hearing him speak with such bitterness, with such disgust, made her stomach drop. When James walked past her in the hallway later that day, he didn't even look at her. That evening, Eliza sat in her room, staring out the window as the sun disappeared behind the horizon. Her chest ached. Why did he hate her? She had never treated him like a charity case, had never even considered his financial background as something that mattered. The next day she tried to approach him after class. "James," she called. He was standing by the window, his books under one arm. He didn't turn. James, she said again, stepping closer. Finally he turned toward her, his face cold. What do you want, Eliza? She hesitated. I wanted to see if you needed help with. I don't need anything from you, James said sharply. Her mouth opened, then closed. Stop trying to buy my attention, James added. His amber eyes were hard and sharp. Go find someone else to obsess over. Eliza's breath hitched. I'm not trying to. James stepped past her, his shoulder brushing hers as he walked away. Eliza stood there for a long time, the sting of his words burning in her chest. After that day she stopped trying. She switched seats in class. She stopped bringing him water. She stopped talking to him altogether. James didn't seem to care. He passed her in the hallway without acknowledgement, sat on the opposite side of the room during lunch, and walked home without so much as a glance in her direction. One afternoon she stood outside the climbing club, the one she had joined because James was in it. She watched as he scaled the rock wall effortlessly, his arms and legs moving with practiced ease. When he came down he saw her standing there and frowned. What are you doing here? He asked. She swallowed hard. I'm quitting the club. James's brow furrowed. Why? Because I don't like climbing, she said evenly. James's jaw tightened. You never liked climbing, he said. But you joined anyway. Eliza didn't respond. James took a step toward her. Do you always chase things you don't really want? Her hands curled into fists at her sides. No. Just people. James's amber eyes darkened. Sign the withdrawal form, he said coldly and handed it to her. Eliza took the paper. Their fingers brushed for a fraction of a second, and then James pulled away. She signed the form and handed it back to him. James took it without looking at her. After that they didn't speak again. But some things are never really over. A month later, Eliza's childhood friend Theo Whitmore transferred back to the school. Theo was everything James was not: relaxed, charming, and easygoing. He came from a wealthy family too, but he wore it lightly without arrogance or pressure. The first time James saw Theo leaning casually against Eliza's locker, his arm resting against the wall as Eliza laughed at something he said, his amber eyes sharpened dangerously. James said nothing. But that night as Eliza sat at her desk staring at the ceiling, she wondered why the thought of James's cold gaze still made her chest ache. She had already let him go. Hadn't she? Eliza had never realized how quiet life could be until she stopped trying with James. It was strange how someone could take up so much space in your life without even trying, and when they were gone that emptiness echoed louder than any noise. She sat through classes without looking toward him anymore. Even though they still shared a few subjects, Eliza became practiced at looking right through him, as if James Westwood didn't exist. She thought it would be hard, thought that her heart would betray her and seek him out instinctively. But to her surprise it got easier. The first week was torture. The second week was uncomfortable. By the third week Eliza felt numb. James never looked at her. Not once. And so Eliza started to focus on herself. She joined the student council and signed up for the drama club. It was a surprise to everyone. Eliza Moreau, who had once been known for following James around like a shadow, suddenly blooming into her own person. Maybe it's for the best, Sophie Aldrich had whispered one afternoon. Sophie was a close friend of James's, a top student herself with her sharp green eyes and immaculate blonde ponytail. She was embarrassing herself, Sophie added, her lips curling into a smile. Eliza had been standing behind a bookshelf in the library when she overheard Sophie's comment. Her chest had tightened painfully, but she forced herself to breathe through it. It didn't matter anymore. He was done trying. And just when Eliza had started to feel stable again, Theo Whitmore walked back into her life. Theo Whitmore was the boy next door. They had grown up together. His family had lived in the house beside hers until Theo's father had accepted a job overseas when they were in middle school. Theo had been Eliza's first friend. He had been the one to pull her out from behind her father's legs when they were kids, the one who always showed up with a basketball and insisted on playing with her even when she hated sports. "I'm not letting you sit around reading all day," he used to say, grinning. "Come on, Eliza. Don't be boring." And now, after 5 years abroad, Theo was back. The first time Eliza saw him again, she almost didn't recognize him. He had grown taller, his lean frame filled out with the sharp, effortless grace of an athlete. His dark hair was casually tousled, and his hazel eyes, once bright with childish mischief, now held a more mature glint. "Hey Eliza," Theo had said, leaning against her locker with his signature grin. "Long time no see." Eliza's heart had fluttered painfully, not from romantic attraction, but from sheer relief. Theo was safe. "You're back?" she said breathlessly. Theo's smile softened. "Yeah. Miss me?" She laughed. "Maybe." It was easy with Theo. He slipped back into her life like he had never left. Theo started walking her to and from school, waiting for her after class and sitting with her during lunch. They didn't need to fill the silence with words. They simply understood each other. Theo never asked about James, and Eliza was grateful for that. But James noticed. It was subtle at first. James would sit at the opposite end of the classroom, but sometimes Eliza would catch his amber eyes flicking toward her when Theo leaned close to say something. When Theo pulled out her chair for her in the cafeteria, James's gaze would harden slightly. When Theo rested his arm casually on Eliza's shoulder as they walked down the hallway, James's jaw would tighten just the slightest bit. But James said nothing. He never intervened. Eliza told herself it was because he didn't care. She told herself that again and again, until the day she realized it wasn't true. It happened after school one afternoon. Theo and Eliza were walking toward the school gate when a light rain began to fall. Eliza didn't have an umbrella, and Theo immediately shrugged off his jacket, holding it over both of their heads as they hurried toward the covered walkway. James was standing by the main building, a book in his hand. He wasn't looking at the rain, he was looking at them. Theo's arm was around Eliza's shoulder. She was laughing, brushing damp strands of hair out of her face as Theo pulled her under the cover of the walkway. Their eyes met across the space between them. James's amber gaze was steady, dark and intense. Eliza's smile faltered. And then James turned and walked away. Eliza didn't know why her chest hurt so much when he left. "Does he like you?" Theo asked the question later that evening as they sat on the steps outside Eliza's house. She looked at him sharply. "Who?" Theo's smile was easy and knowing. "James." Eliza scoffed. "Don't be ridiculous." "I'm not." Theo leaned back on his elbows, gazing up at the sky. "He looks at you like you belong to him." Eliza's stomach flipped unpleasantly. "He doesn't care about me." Theo gave her a long, considering look. "If you say so." But Eliza couldn't stop thinking about the way James had looked at her that afternoon. The tension in his jaw, the sharpness in his gaze. Well, it didn't matter. James had made it clear how he felt. Theo stood and stretched. "Come on. I'll walk you inside." Eliza smiled and let Theo take her hand as they walked back into the house. But James wasn't finished with her yet. A week later, Eliza was sitting in the library when James slid into the seat across from her. She froze. James didn't say anything for a long moment. He opened a book, flipped through the pages without reading them. Eliza stared at him. Finally, she broke the silence. "What are you doing?" James's amber eyes lifted to hers. "Studying." "Then why are you sitting here?" James's gaze darkened. "Do you want me to leave?" Eliza's throat tightened. "I don't care what you do." James didn't move. "Then I'll stay." Eliza narrowed her eyes. "What do you want, James?" James closed his book and leaned forward slightly. His gaze sharpened. "You spend a lot of time with Theo." Eliza's brow furrowed. "What's that got to do with anything?" James's eyes darkened. "I didn't realize you two were so close." Eliza's lips curled into a smirk. "Does that bother you?" James's jaw tightened. "Why would it?" "Exactly." Eliza stood up and gathered her books. James's hand shot out and curled around her wrist. She froze. His grip wasn't tight, but the warmth of his hand against her skin sent shivers up her spine. "Eliza," James said quietly. Her breath caught. James's amber eyes softened just slightly. "I didn't mean what I said before." Her chest tightened painfully. "Then why did you say it?" James's gaze dropped to the floor. His grip on her wrist loosened, but he didn't let go. "Because I didn't know how to," he trailed off. Eliza swallowed the lump in her throat. "How to what?" James's gaze lifted to hers. His expression was raw, vulnerable in a way she had never seen before. "How to want something I couldn't have," he said. Her breath caught. James's fingers brushed against the inside of her wrist. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. For everything. Eliza's chest squeezed painfully. For a second, just a second, she almost believed him. But then she pulled her wrist free and took a step back. You don't get to come back now, she said. James's eyes flashed with something sharp and painful. You don't get to walk away after pushing me away for so long, Eliza added. James didn't move. He stood there, still and silent, as Eliza turned and walked away. Her heart was racing painfully. And for the first time in weeks, Eliza realized her hands were shaking. James's presence lingered in Eliza's mind far longer than it should have. Even after she walked away from him in the library, the echo of his words stayed with her. How to want something I couldn't have. Eliza lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, the memory of his amber eyes cutting through her chest like a knife. She had imagined this moment for years, James finally admitting that he cared about her. But now that it had happened, all she could feel was anger. He didn't get to say those words now. Not after everything. Theo's voice pulled her back into the present. Earth to Eliza. She blinked, looking up to find Theo watching her across the small table at the cafe. His hand was casually wrapped around a cup of coffee, his hazel eyes slightly narrowed in amusement. Sorry, she murmured. Theo leaned his chin on his hand. Let me guess. Westwood. Eliza scowled. Don't start. Theo's mouth curled into a knowing smile. I didn't say anything. Eliza shot him a sharp look, but Theo only chuckled. He had that easy, unaffected confidence that made people feel comfortable around him, but it also meant that he rarely took things seriously. I just don't see why you're still letting him get to you, Theo said after a moment. I'm not, Eliza replied quickly. Theo raised an eyebrow. Right. I'm serious. Theo smiled faintly. Of course you are. Eliza glared at him. Theo. Hey, Theo interrupted, his smile fading slightly. I'm not judging you, Eliza. But, are you sure you're not holding on to something that isn't there anymore? Her heart twisted painfully. That was the problem. James was still there, lingering beneath the surface under her skin despite all the walls she had built. And now, with Theo back in her life, those walls were starting to crack. James was starting to crack too. It started with small things. A week after the library incident, Eliza noticed that James was showing up more often in places where she hadn't seen him before. She would sit in the back of the lecture hall and James would be there, a row or two ahead of her, his amber eyes flicking toward her when he thought she wasn't looking. She would be walking with Theo toward the school gates, and James would appear nearby, leaning casually against the wall, watching them with an expression that was too guarded to be casual. And then there were the small, almost imperceptible gestures. The day her student council report slipped from her bag and scattered across the hallway, James was the one who knelt down to help her gather the papers. You don't have to. I know, James replied quietly, handing her the last page. Their fingers brushed. Eliza's breath caught. James's eyes were steady as he looked at her. I want to. She stood there, frozen, until Theo's voice cut through the tension. Eliza. James's gaze flicked toward Theo as he approached. His expression darkened, his jaw tightening. Theo slid his arm around Eliza's shoulder, completely unaware of the tension between them. You ready? Eliza hesitated. James's eyes sharpened. I'll see you around, he said, his voice cold as he straightened and walked away. Theo watched him go. You know, he said, for someone who claims not to care, he sure spends a lot of time watching you. Eliza sighed. Don't start. Theo smiled. I'm not starting. I'm just observing. But James wasn't the only one who noticed. Sophie Aldridge's green eyes sharpened over the rim of her coffee cup. You've been spending a lot of time with Theo, Sophie said. Eliza didn't look up from her book. So? Sophie's smile was thin. Just an observation. Are you taking notes for someone? Sophie's gaze sharpened. James doesn't care if that's what you're implying. Eliza's jaw tensed. Of course not. Sophie leaned forward slightly, her smile turning brittle. Good. Because James has more important things to focus on than you. Eliza's chest tightened painfully. Is that so? Sophie's smile widened. Absolutely. Eliza's heart hammered in her chest. She wanted to say something sharp, something cutting, but the words wouldn't come. So instead she stood and walked away. But the weight of Sophie's words followed her down the hall. It was late. Eliza had stayed behind to organize the student council office. The hallway was empty except for the soft hum of the overhead lights. She was locking up the office when James's voice broke the silence. "You're close with Theo." Eliza turned, startled. James was standing a few feet away, his hands in the pockets of his jacket, his gaze shadowed beneath the low lighting. "What?" "You heard me," James said, stepping closer. "You spend a lot of time with him." Eliza's spine stiffened. "I don't see why that's your business." James's amber eyes darkened. "It's not." "Then why are you bringing it up?" James's jaw tightened. "Because I don't like it." Eliza's breath hitched. "Excuse me." James's gaze sharpened. "I don't like seeing you with him." Eliza's heart hammered in her chest. "You don't get to say that." James stepped closer, close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his body. "I know," he said quietly. "But it doesn't change the fact that I hate it." Eliza's breath caught painfully. "Why?" James's gaze flicked toward her mouth, then back to her eyes. "You already know why." Her pulse stuttered. "Say it." James's gaze softened just slightly. "Because it should have been me." Eliza's chest tightened painfully. James hesitated, his expression raw. "I should have been the one standing next to you." Eliza's throat burned. "Then why weren't you?" James's jaw tightened. "Because I was a coward." Eliza's breath hitched painfully. "I pushed you away because I thought," James trailed off, his expression hardening. "Because I thought you deserved better." Her chest squeezed. "You don't get to decide that for me." James's gaze sharpened. "I know." "And now what?" she demanded. "You expect me to forget everything?" James's hand curled into a fist at his side. "No." "Then what do you want?" James's amber eyes darkened. "I want another chance." Eliza's breath caught. James stepped even closer, so close that her back hit the wall. His hands were braced on either side of her head. "I know I don't deserve it," he said quietly. "But I'm asking anyway." Eliza's heart was pounding so hard it hurt. "Why now?" she whispered. James's gaze softened. "Because I don't want to lose you." Eliza's chest ached. "You already did." James's gaze sharpened. "Maybe." Slowly, carefully, he reached up, his fingers brushing the line of her jaw. Eliza's breath caught painfully. James's amber eyes darkened. "But that doesn't mean I'm not going to try." Her heart twisted. "James." "I know," James said softly. "You don't trust me." Eliza's throat tightened painfully. "I'm going to fix that," he said. Eliza's heart slammed painfully against her chest. "And how do you plan to do that?" James's eyes softened. Slowly. Her breath hitched. "And relentlessly," James added. Eliza's eyes burned. "I hate you," she whispered. James smiled faintly. "No you don't," he said. Eliza closed her eyes as James's hand brushed her cheek. Her heart was beating so fast it hurt. She was falling again. And it terrified her. Eliza avoided James for the next 2 days. Not because she wanted to, but she had to. After that night, after the quiet promise in his voice, the way his hand brushed against her jaw, the heat in his gaze, Eliza's heart had been thundering so loudly it drowned out every logical thought. She had nearly let him back in. Nearly given him the chance to break her all over again. She couldn't let that happen. So she pulled back. She stopped sitting near him in class. She left the hallway when she saw him approaching. And when James's eyes followed her, his expression quietly dark, she refused to meet his gaze. Theo noticed. "So," he said one afternoon, leaning against her locker with that lazy grin of his. "Did something happen between you and Westwood?" Eliza's hand stilled on the lock. "No." Theo raised an eyebrow. "Right. That's why you're avoiding him like he's radioactive." Eliza sighed and rubbed the back of her neck. "I'm not avoiding him." Theo's hazel eyes sharpened. "You sure?" "Why does it matter?" "Because he's not exactly subtle, Eliza." Theo's gaze flicked toward the hallway where James was standing at the far end talking to one of the teachers. But he wasn't focused on the teacher. He was looking at her. Eliza's breath hitched painfully. Theo's mouth curled into a faint smile. "See what I mean?" "I'm not getting involved with him," Eliza said firmly. Theo's gaze softened. "Then why does it look like you're already involved?" Theo was too perceptive. That was the problem. And the other problem, the bigger problem, was that James had stopped pretending he didn't care. It was subtle at first. James started sitting closer in class, not next to her but near enough that Eliza was aware of his presence. When she dropped her pencil, James was the one who handed it back to her, their fingers brushing for the briefest moment before he let go. And then one day when Eliza forgot her umbrella, James was the one standing by the school gate holding his own. She stared at him as the rain fell around them. "You'll get wet," he said calmly. "I'm fine," Eliza replied stiffly. James held the umbrella out toward her. "Take it." "I said I'm fine." James's eyes darkened. "Stop being stubborn." Eliza's chest tightened painfully. "Why do you care?" James's hand tensed on the umbrella. "Because I do." Eliza's throat burned. "I don't need your charity," she whispered. James's jaw tightened. "It's not charity." "Then what is it?" James's amber gaze softened. "A second chance." Eliza's breath hitched painfully. But before she could answer, Theo's voice cut through the rain. "Eliza." They both turned. Theo was walking toward them, his hands in his pockets, his expression calm. James's hand tightened around the umbrella. "I've got it from here," Theo said, his tone light. James's gaze sharpened dangerously. Eliza's chest squeezed. She took a breath and stepped toward Theo. "Thanks," she murmured. James's amber eyes darkened. He watched as Theo slipped his jacket around Eliza's shoulders and led her away. When Eliza glanced back, James was still standing there, his hand clenched around the umbrella, his expression cold and shuttered. The confrontation happened after school 2 days later. Eliza was at her locker, gathering her books, when Sophie Aldridge approached. "Eliza." Eliza's shoulders tensed. "What do you want?" Sophie's green eyes sharpened. "You should be careful." Eliza raised an eyebrow. "Of what?" Sophie smiled faintly. "James." Eliza's chest tightened. "Why would I need to be careful of him?" "Because he's dangerous," Sophie replied smoothly. "He gets bored easily. And you're just another temporary distraction." Eliza's heart hammered painfully. "And you know that because?" Sophie's smile widened. "Because he told me." Eliza's breath hitched painfully. "You're lying." "Am I?" Sophie leaned closer. "You think you're special because James looked at you a few times? Because he sat next to you in class?" Eliza's hands curled into fists. "He'll lose interest," Sophie said, her voice sharp and sweet. "Just like he always does." Eliza's chest ached with something raw and angry. But before she could answer, James's voice cut through the hallway. "Sophie." Sophie's smile froze. James was standing at the end of the hallway, his amber eyes cold. His jaw was tight, his expression sharp and dangerous. Sophie straightened. "James." "Walk away," James said softly. Sophie hesitated. "I was just." "Walk away." Sophie's mouth tightened. She shot Eliza one last sharp look before turning on her heel and walking away. James's gaze followed her until she disappeared around the corner. Then his eyes slid back to Eliza. Eliza's chest tightened. "Did you really say that?" James's gaze darkened. "No." Eliza's throat burned. "So why would she?" "Because Sophie has her own reasons," James said quietly. "But I'm not going to explain them." Eliza's heart twisted painfully. "Why not?" James's amber gaze sharpened. "Because it doesn't matter what Sophie says," he said. "What matters is what you believe." Eliza's breath caught. James stepped closer, close enough that Eliza had to tilt her chin to meet his gaze. "What do you believe, Eliza?" Her heart slammed painfully against her chest. "I don't know," she whispered. James's gaze softened. "Then let me prove it to you." Her throat tightened. "How?" James's gaze darkened. "By not walking away this time." Eliza's breath hitched. "I pushed you away before because I was scared," James said quietly. "But I'm not scared anymore." Eliza's hands curled into fists at her sides. "You can't just say that now." "I know." James's gaze sharpened. "But I'm not leaving." Eliza's chest ached painfully. "James." "I'm not leaving," he repeated, his gaze steady. "Not until you believe me." Eliza's heart was pounding so hard it hurt. "And if I don't?" she whispered. James's mouth curled into a faint smile. "Then I'll wait." Her breath hitched. James's amber eyes darkened. As long as it takes. But James didn't have to wait long. Later that night, Eliza sat on the steps outside her house. Theo sat next to her, his arm resting on the back of the step. "You okay?" Theo asked. Eliza's chest tightened. "No." Theo's smile faded. "James." Eliza closed her eyes. "He said." "What?" "He said he's not leaving," Eliza murmured. Theo's mouth curled into a faint smile. "And how do you feel about that?" Eliza's throat tightened. "I don't know." Theo's gaze softened. "Yes, you do." Eliza's breath hitched. "It's complicated." Theo smiled faintly. "It's only complicated if you let it be." Eliza's heart twisted painfully. Theo's gaze softened. "So what are you going to do?" Eliza's breath caught. Theo smiled. "You don't have to figure it out right now." Eliza's chest ached. "I'm scared," she whispered. Theo's smile softened. "Then maybe that's how you know it's real." Her breath hitched painfully. Eliza's heart was pounding painfully in her chest. James had made his choice. Now it was her turn. James wasn't going to walk away this time. But that didn't mean Eliza was ready to let him back in. Not yet. But maybe soon. James had stopped pretending he didn't care. He made that abundantly clear in the days that followed. Eliza wasn't sure when it had started. Maybe it had always been there, lingering beneath the surface. But now it was impossible to ignore. James was everywhere. It started with small things. A week after their confrontation in the hallway, Eliza was working late in the student council room when the janitor came by to lock up. "You need to leave, Miss Moreau," the janitor said apologetically. Eliza sighed, glancing down at the half-finished report in front of her. She stood and started packing her things, only to find James standing by the door. "Come on," he said calmly. Eliza's brow furrowed. "What are you doing here?" James shrugged. "Saw the lights were still on. And I figured you'd be here." Eliza's heart hammered painfully. James pushed off the doorframe and stepped toward her. He took the heavy binder out of her hands and slipped it under his arm. "You don't have to." James's amber eyes darkened. "I know." Eliza's breath hitched. James held the door open. "Let's go." Eliza hesitated, but only for a second. She followed him out. James started showing up more often. At first, Eliza thought it was a coincidence. But it wasn't. One afternoon she was sitting on the bleachers during gym class, pretending to study while the boys played basketball. James was on the court. Eliza had never seen him play before. He moved with effortless grace, sharp turns, clean passes, perfect shots. Theo was on the opposing team. And when Theo caught the ball and passed it to a teammate, James's eyes flicked toward Eliza. Their gazes locked. James's mouth curled into a faint smile. Theo cut in front of him, blocking the pass, and James's smile vanished. Theo grinned. Eyes on the ball, Westwood. James's gaze sharpened. Theo lunged toward the basket, but James was faster. He intercepted the ball, spun around Theo, and made a clean shot. Theo laughed breathlessly as the ball swished through the net. "Nice," Theo said, clapping James on the shoulder. James didn't smile. His amber eyes flicked toward Eliza, sharp and steady. Theo followed his gaze. He sighed. "You know, if you want her attention, you could try asking her out instead of showing off." James's jaw tightened. "I don't need advice from you," James said coldly. Theo smiled faintly. "Suit yourself." James's gaze slid toward Eliza again. Eliza's breath hitched. She dropped her gaze to her notebook. Her hands were shaking. Eliza hated how much she still cared. But she did care. No matter how hard she tried to forget it, to shove those feelings into the deepest part of her chest, they kept coming back. The problem wasn't that James had started noticing her. The problem was that he had never stopped. And now he wasn't hiding it anymore. It all came to a head 2 weeks later. It was the night of the annual spring festival. The whole school was gathered in the main courtyard, lit by strings of white lights and glowing paper lanterns. Music drifted through the cool night air and couples swayed lazily beneath the trees. Eliza was standing near the edge of the courtyard with Theo. Theo handed her a drink. "You okay?" Eliza sighed. "I'm fine." Theo smiled faintly. "Liar." Eliza's chest tightened painfully. Her eyes drifted toward the far end of the courtyard, toward James. He was standing near the edge of the crowd talking to Sophie. Eliza's stomach twisted painfully. James wasn't smiling. His amber gaze was guarded. Sophie leaned toward him, laughing at something he said. James didn't laugh. He wasn't even looking at her. He was looking at Eliza. Her breath hitched. Theo followed her gaze. Are you really going to let Sophie win? Theo asked quietly. Eliza's throat tightened. It's not a competition. Theo smiled faintly. It is to her. Eliza's heart hammered painfully. Theo took a step toward her. He brushed a strand of hair behind her ear. You could make it easier for him, Theo said softly. Eliza's chest squeezed. What do you mean? Theo smiled. Let him know you're not going to run this time. Eliza's heart slammed against her ribs. I can't, she whispered. Theo's smile faded. Why not? Because he could hurt me again. Theo's expression softened. Or maybe this time he won't. Eliza's throat burned. Theo tucked a finger beneath her chin and lifted her gaze toward his. And if he does, Theo smiled faintly, you'll still have me. Eliza's eyes burned. Theo. I'm not going anywhere, Theo said quietly. Her chest tightened painfully. Theo leaned down and pressed a soft kiss to her forehead. Just think about it. Eliza stood there, heart hammering as Theo walked away. When she finally glanced toward the other side of the courtyard, James was gone. She found him near the edge of the festival grounds. James was standing by the old cherry tree. His hands were tucked into the pockets of his jacket. His gaze was distant. Eliza hesitated. She could turn around and walk away. She could keep pretending that she didn't care. She took a shaky breath and stepped toward him. James's gaze lifted. You left, Eliza said quietly. James's jaw tightened. You seemed busy. Eliza's chest squeezed. With Theo. James's gaze darkened. Eliza hesitated. James's mouth curled into a faint smile. He likes you. Maybe. James's gaze sharpened. And what about you? Her heart slammed painfully. Eliza's throat burned. I don't know. James's amber eyes softened. You do know, he said quietly. You're just scared to admit it. Her breath hitched painfully. Why now? She whispered. James's gaze darkened. Because I made a mistake, he said quietly. And I don't want to spend the rest of my life regretting it. Eliza's chest ached. James. You were right, he said quietly. I pushed you away because I was scared. Eliza's throat burned. And now, she whispered. James's gaze softened. I'm still scared. Eliza's heart twisted painfully. But I'm not walking away this time, James said softly. Her breath hitched. James's hand lifted. His fingers brushed against the side of her face. Eliza closed her eyes. I hate you, she whispered. James's mouth curled into a faint smile. No, you don't. Her chest squeezed. James's thumb brushed the edge of her jaw. Eliza's breath hitched. James's amber gaze softened. Give me a chance, he whispered. Eliza's eyes burned. James's hand slid to the back of her neck. He leaned down, his breath warm against her temple. Please. Eliza's heart hammered painfully. Slowly, carefully, James's lips brushed her forehead. Eliza's throat tightened. Her hands curled into the front of his jacket. James's breath hitched. Eliza's eyes burned. She pulled away slightly. James. He waited. His amber eyes steady. Eliza's chest squeezed. I'm not ready yet, she whispered. James's gaze softened. Okay, he murmured. Her breath hitched. James smiled faintly. I'll wait. Eliza's throat burned. Until you're ready. Eliza didn't sleep that night. She lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling, her heart thudding painfully in her chest. James's words echoed in her mind. Until you're ready. She could still feel the warmth of his hand on her face, the brush of his breath against her temple, the quiet intensity of his gaze as he promised to wait. James Westwood had never been one to wait. He had always been steady and composed, the boy who relied on logic and reason rather than instinct. But now he was waiting for her. And that terrified Eliza more than anything. James wasn't subtle after that. The next morning, Eliza stepped into the library and found James sitting at one of the long tables near the window. His amber eyes lifted immediately when she walked in. Eliza hesitated. For a moment she considered walking away, but James's gaze softened and her feet betrayed her. She walked toward him. James didn't say anything as she slid into the seat across from him. He simply handed her a notebook. "What's this?" Eliza asked. James's mouth curled into a faint smile. "The answers to last week's math assignment." Eliza raised an eyebrow. "Did I ask for your help?" James's gaze darkened. "You didn't have to." Her chest squeezed painfully. Eliza hesitated, then opened the notebook. His handwriting was sharp and neat, each solution carefully labeled. Her throat tightened. "You don't have to keep doing this," Eliza said quietly. James's amber eyes sharpened. "I know." Her breath hitched. James leaned back slightly in his chair, his gaze steady. "But I want to." Eliza's heart twisted painfully. She closed the notebook and pushed it toward him. James's brow furrowed slightly. Eliza's gaze softened. "I can figure it out on my own." James's mouth curled into a faint smile. "I know." And yet, the next day there was a bottle of water on her desk. The day after that, James pulled her chair out for her before class started. And the day after that, he was the one who slid a jacket over her shoulders when the room got cold. "James," she protested. "You don't have to say anything," James said quietly. "Just, let me take care of you." Her throat tightened. "Why?" James's amber eyes darkened. "Because I never stopped wanting to." Eliza wasn't the only one who noticed. One afternoon, Theo slid into the seat next to her during lunch. Eliza raised an eyebrow. "What?" Theo's smile was faint. "James." Eliza sighed. "Not this again." Theo's smile widened. "He's hovering." Eliza's gaze slid toward the far end of the cafeteria, where James was standing near the vending machine. He was talking to another student, but his gaze kept flicking toward her. "He's not hovering," Eliza muttered. Theo's brow lifted. "No." Eliza's cheeks warmed. Theo's smile softened. "You know you don't have to make this difficult, right?" "I'm not." Theo gave her a knowing look. "Eliza." Eliza's throat tightened. Theo's gaze softened. "You're allowed to forgive him." Her breath hitched. "It's not that simple." Theo smiled faintly. "It could be." Eliza's chest squeezed. Theo stood. "Just think about it." She watched as Theo walked away. Her gaze flicked toward James. His amber eyes met hers across the cafeteria. Eliza's heart hammered painfully. She stood. James's gaze darkened. Eliza walked toward him. James straightened as she stopped in front of him. "I'm not ready," Eliza said quietly. James's jaw tightened. "I know." Eliza's chest tightened. "But I want to try." James's eyes sharpened. Eliza hesitated. "If that's okay with you." James's mouth curled into a faint smile. "It's okay." Eliza's breath hitched. James reached for her hand. His fingers brushed lightly against hers. Not demanding, not pushing, just waiting. Eliza's chest ached. Slowly, carefully, she curled her fingers around his. James's breath hitched. Eliza smiled faintly. "I guess this is a start." James's amber eyes softened. "It's enough," he said quietly. But not everyone was happy about it. The next day, Eliza walked into the student council room and found Sophie sitting at the desk. Sophie's green eyes sharpened immediately. "You're really giving him another chance?" Eliza stiffened. "What's it to you?" Sophie's smile was thin. "James is going to break you again." Eliza's chest tightened. "I don't think he will," Eliza said evenly. Sophie's mouth curled into a sharp smile. "And when he does?" Eliza's gaze hardened. "If he does," Eliza said quietly, "I'll handle it." Sophie's smile faded. Eliza turned and walked away. Her heart was thundering painfully in her chest, but her steps were steady. James was waiting for her outside the council room. Eliza stopped. James's gaze softened. "Everything okay?" Her throat tightened. "Yeah." James's gaze darkened slightly. "Sophie." Eliza's chest squeezed. "It doesn't matter," she murmured. James's brow furrowed. Eliza stepped toward him. James's breath hitched. "She's wrong," Eliza said quietly. James's amber eyes sharpened. "About what?" Eliza's gaze softened. "You're not going to break me." James's breath caught. Eliza smiled faintly. Not this time. James's hand slid to the side of her face. You're sure? Eliza's throat tightened. Yeah. James's thumb brushed against her cheek. Eliza's heart hammered painfully. Slowly, carefully James leaned down. Their foreheads brushed. Eliza, he whispered. Her breath hitched. James's lips brushed hers. A soft, careful kiss. Eliza's chest tightened. James pulled away slightly. Okay, he whispered. Eliza's hands curled into the front of his jacket. Okay. James smiled faintly. Good. Eliza laughed softly. James's amber eyes softened. Are you still scared? Eliza's breath hitched. Yeah. James's hand brushed down her back. Me too, he said quietly. Eliza's chest ached. James smiled faintly. Then we'll figure it out together. Her throat tightened. Together. James's gaze softened. Yeah. Eliza's heart slammed painfully. James smiled. You ready? Eliza's eyes burned. She lifted her chin. Yeah. James smiled. He slid his hand into hers. And this time, Eliza didn't let go. Because this time she knew he wouldn't let go either. The